Creating beyond calculation, beyond politics, and beyond the big two. Welcome, Silverliners, to the wonderful world of Wednesday Wham. I'm your host, Dean Zachary. We're joined tonight by one of the wizards of wordplay, Rory Boyle, Rob Davis, the paragon of pencils, and of course, Aaron the contrarian Humphreys. And we're missing the Empress of the Ink. She is not feeling well. We wish her the best. Tonight's a special episode, so I'm going to add a little background music to it. Tonight, we're going to be discussing literary comic books and why they are considered to be in this lofty category. Is it earned, or is it all just smoke and mirrors? Find out as you listen to our commentary tonight, kids. This should be fun. I'd like to start by simply reading an introductory paragraph from a site called Listverse. The author is Robert Frey, and Robert has been fact-checked by Alex Hanton. And I'd like to begin by just reading this straight up, and then we'll talk about it. For decades, the comic book industry, at least the mainstream industry, was targeted exclusively towards juveniles. Over the last 30 years, however, the industry has grown up and more books are written with adult readers in mind. A lot of these books are written by very talented individuals and are very fun to read. Unfortunately, a large segment of what's out there is largely what is termed escapist literature, and like most genre fiction, fails to amount to anything more than just an enjoyable read. This isn't because the medium itself is limited or inferior. However, the medium has already produced several masterpieces rich in depth. This is a list of the top 10 works which are not just great comic books to read, but comic books which, in terms of literary merit, could easily go toe-to-toe with the greatest works in literature and film, he said, trying not to laugh. Several authors on this list have written multiple works which could easily make the list, but I've limited the list to only one work, the very best, by each author. Thank you, Robert, for your brilliance and insight. We begin with number 10 on his list, Mary Jane, Spider-Man Loves Mary Jane by Sean McKeever. Now, I really just want you guys to riff on this. That was a pretty long intro to go right into Mary Jane. I mean, I really want to focus on this one line. I'm not picking on Robert. This is Robert's opinion. Everybody's right to their opinion. I just have to find it kind of, questionable when he says, unfortunately, a large segment of what's out there is largely what is termed as escapist literature.
Yeah, that's the first
joined by Roberta.
What's wrong with that?
Yeah. Welcome. So glad to see you.
Hey,
Roberta. You missed the Masterpiece Theater music. So since you missed it, we're gonna annoy everybody and take it from the top. So I don't know. And then the computer, of course, decides it doesn't want to do it. But what I was saying was, what we're going to talk about tonight is the placement of certain comics in the literary category and why. And I just read an intro from a site called Listverse where the author Robert Frey tells us that each of his choices could easily go toe-to-toe with the very best in literature and film. So, okay, dude, you're really setting the bar high here. So we start out, and I just lifted one little segment of his opening paragraph, and he says, unfortunately, a large segment of what's out there is what is termed escapist literature, and like most genre fiction, fails to amount to anything more than just an enjoyable read. And we all know that that's far below the aspirations of literature. Literature indeed. So he begins his list with number 10, ladies and gentlemen, Mary Jane, Spider-Man Loves Mary Jane by Sean McKeever. Now, I haven't read it, so I'm going to throw it out to you guys. He does say that it is an attempt to appeal to the preteen teen girl demographic, which tells me right away it breaks our motto here at this podcast of creating beyond calculation. It's calculated. Okay, so they've already broken our motto, so we already sort of, hold in a bit of contempt. But only mildly so, as we are fair. and cheerful warriors. We do not attack, we just have fun. The comic itself takes place in an alternate version of the Marvel Universe where Mary Jane and Gwen Stacy went to high school with Norman Osborn, Peter Parker, Flash Thompson, and Liz Allen. Despite occurring within the superhero-infested universe, the book has very little superhero fare. Spider-Man makes few appearances. Yes. Spider-Man makes few appearances and is presented largely as an unrealistic celebrity crush of Mary Jane's until very late in the comics run. Well, I know that's why I go to comic book stores, kids. To pick up a book
it's funny because
teenage crush where the superhero doesn't even make an appearance till the end. That's why I read comics, kids. I don't know about you guys. Anyway.
Well, it just seems like most literature you could have discussions about the subtext or whatever. But I mean, I guess a discussion for this one is does Spider-Man indeed love Mary Jane? And if we all agree yes, I guess the discussion's over.
Well, here's the part.
Well done.
Here's the substantive portion of the review. The comic is largely centered around the typical teenage problems experienced by Mary Jane and her friends, particularly problems involving teenage dating and crushes. And, we all know that is the stuff of literature, right? I mean, teenage dating.
Yeah, sure.
Romeo and Juliet.
Jane Austen.
Romeo and Juliet. Jane Austen. Right. So, again, this is a
Pride,
matter
Prejudice, and Zombies.
Right.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's I don't know. What do you guys think? I mean, your take. I'm not going to just rant here. I want you guys to kind of.
Oh no, just rant.
Just gonna. Rory, thoughts on Mary Jane? Let's see. Mary Jane. Spider-Man loves Mary Jane.
It seems like it's a kind of in line with that. Debbie loves Dallas, but there's another word there that we use for that infamous thing. It feels like a comic book version of that, like just substitute the word.
Dallas.
I wasn't going there. I never thought about that.
It's just it's in the title. I mean, it's like
yeah, it is. It is in the title. The question is, what exactly elevates this to literature? The comics are all deep and well drawn out, while remaining average, immature, angst-ridden teens. The characters, I should say, they're deep. They're well drawn out while remaining average, immature, angst-ridden teens. What really sets McKeever's comic apart, though, is that he manages to perfectly capture how it feels to be a teenager and what most of us went through when we started developing romantic feelings. Well, yeah, and
Spider-Man.
Okay, but literature. I mean, I get that, right?
Yeah,
okay,
see, I wouldn't elevate that to literature. That's
just good writing.
Good writing. Okay, Roberta, good writing. Talk to me about something that along those lines.
It's a smaller picture, though. Is it really?
It is. Yep.
It's like a microcosm of someone's perspective. It's not really everyone can't, through the ages relate.
Yeah.
It would seem,
in other words,
juvenile and adolescent.
Yeah, right.
Because it's written for juvenile adolescents.
Adolescents, right. So for a kid's book, right, are we saying for a kid's book, this might be elevated to literature in Robert's opinion? And maybe it is. Again, this is all opinion. We all have a right to voice our opinions and not be, mean about it. But the point is that I really don't see the case fully made for this being elevated to a literary comic. No. Does anybody see that? Because I think
not with what he says there. No.
Yeah, not with what he says there. To me, literature, and let's step back a little bit because I'll sort of lay a foundational position here. To me, literature certainly at its basic qualification has to approach something along the Socratic line, right? Socrates said that the cultivation of virtue in the human experience and the discussion of that, the addressing of that, how we relate to human life, and the macrocosm of that, and how it reaches everyone in a broad sense, a connection to humanity, to me would have to be a prerequisite in many cases, in my opinion, for something to be called literature. Does that?
Well, you could also explore those things to character studies. I mean,
certainly.
It doesn't have to. I mean, The Great Gatsby.
Would you say character studies, or are you pulling out one individual character?
Yeah, like you're doing, you're telling the story about the idea of a certain character, of
It's like an
mice and
archetype.
men. It's a good one,
Yeah, like
sometimes
Moby Dick is about obsession.
exactly, but it's told
Yeah.
through a character study. It's a study of
Right,
the character.
right,
So
right.
I think there can be that.
It
I mean,
makes it
could you do
palatable.
that? Yeah, could you do that with Spider-Man? Yeah, I mean, yeah, I guess you could with superheroes. I think sometimes the thing that, and this
Harder.
is the thing I always find so funny about comic books, is they've always tried to, when they bring up comics as literature, a lot of them do other types of comics, but we've always had this really big thing in comics that we want people to take superhero comics seriously. Like, even though we have other comics and all these genres, it's like, no, but you need to take superhero comics. And like, look, Watchmen, regardless of what it says, I just don't think many people are going to discover the virtues of life through a guy dressed like an owl. I just think that's always going to get in the way. If somebody
It's hard
got
to
on
relate.
stage in front of you and started talking about the philosophical virtues of life and morals, and was dressed like an owl, you'd probably not hear what he says, because you'd be sitting the whole time going like, well, what is with the owl costume?
Kind of
That's probably
that's a
be
fair-
at Bohemian Grove, right?
That's a fair
Yeah.
point. I would also submit, though, that if we look at the Shakespearean character of Puck, there's
Mm.
Yeah.
also there's a satirical sort of outlandish nature
Yeah.
to some of these Shakespearean characters, and yet they might address lofty issues that you present. But
Right.
my point is, I like where you're going with your direction in the sense of it. Why do we feel like we have to elevate superhero beyond anything for what it is, and B,
Right.
why is that so important to take it seriously, and C, why separate things into literature and not literature? Why do that to
Yeah.
begin with? And I think if we explore that question, we start to come to the answer that people like to make something a exclusive club, and they like to make themselves
Yep.
feel important
Yep.
and say, no, now this club you get to get in, but you other
Right.
people
No.
over there, you don't get to come into this club.
Yeah, it's qualitative.
Yeah, it's quality. And again, I'm not saying people shouldn't do that. I'm just saying I think let's be honest. This is a tangent subject, and then I'll get back to this. As an artist, going to art school and becoming a graphic artist is
Yeah.
very interesting to understand and to come into contact with not only professors but other students who would look down their nose. Oh, you're going to be a commercial artist instead of
I
like
got that
a
all the
fine
time.
artist.
Yeah, I got
So-
that.
Yeah, I got that.
Everybody got that, right? So
I didn't get that. I just write things.
Yeah, well, there you go. Well, but again, literature versus pulp fiction and so on. This
I know I'm
obsession-
good. You guys have to fight for it.
See, there it is.
Well, it's like, will you make a living, or
Will you
will
suffer
you
for your
affect
art?
the rest
Yeah.
of the
world.
generations
See,
to come
The
and make a
point
mark?
the point is, in my opinion, every single one of those paths is valid. There's not a path that's more valid than the other path.
Right.
I believe in
Yeah.
the open tent, the wide open tent,
Mhm.
right? Where someone can write a complete farce, and if it illuminates something about humanity that's universal, then that's wonderful. But it's still a farce. But
Yeah.
who's to say, well, that has earned literary status, or this has not earned literary status, right? So that's the sort of the
you
philosophical,
won't know.
intellectual aspect of this.
You won't know
think-
until 100 years from now.
Yeah, right.
Well, I think also when a lot of traditional literature was written, what we consider the classics, they were written in a vacuum.
Right.
And I do think that's important, because they didn't have the influence of others.
Mm.
They weren't trying to sell them. They weren't trying to get rich off it. They were trying to, a lot of them were writing about philosophical ideas and stuff. I mean, they obviously would sell to make, a living, but that was not their goal. I mean, back in then you didn't have, as much. I think writing in a vacuum, people are writing about ideas and thoughts that occur to them and not really looking at what sells in the marketplace.
There was
Are you
some of
talking-
that, depending on the
Yeah.
time period you're talking about, Aaron.
Yeah.
So, like, if you're talking, the ancient philosophers, it's a completely different world. And when
Yeah,
you're
it's
talking
completely
about,
different.
Right.
Yeah.
16th
Mhm.
century, and you're talking about, or you're talking about Shakespearean times, he's trying to sell a play, right? So
Right,
he
he's
is
trying to
actually-
sell
He's
tickets
actually
or
trying to
whatever.
sell food.
Yeah,
That's how he made money at the theater, selling the food, just like they do in theaters
just
today.
like they do in theaters.
Yeah, exactly.
So there's an aspect of that, but again, your point is well taken that it's not created in a vacuum. You have to take into account the context of the day in which it was written and the person writing it, or persons. There's this whole theory that Shakespeare was a group of writers. I don't particularly ascribe to that.
Well, Disney movies are the perfect example of, to me, what the general public thinks of superheroes beyond the people who've read the comics or grown up and liked them, because they're so goofy and farced.
Sure.
And they came that way because it was almost like, they just didn't think, well, no one take this stuff seriously. No one can take it as, literature or whatever. So it's almost like, I don't know how to explain it. It's this sort of making fun of stuff. Okay, so like,
it's sort
my
of
friend used to go into like an
parroting.
It's a parody. Well, he used to go into a store and camp, right? Well, he used to go into a store and like my friend would be like, "This is a kind of an attitude in Portland." They would go down and be like, "Let's go buy a bunch of '80s records," not because that's cool. They like it because it'd be a big goof to go buy a bunch of '80s records and make fun of it. The Marvel movies to me are almost like that. Let's make a bunch of movies, but we know this stuff's stupid, and we know the only way to sell it. It's like when they're selling it to the audience, they're selling it in such a goofy, dumb way that they know this is the only way the audience is going to take it. Because they actually tried to play it seriously, like we did with the Batman versus Superman. Nobody liked it. It's too dark. Superheroes are supposed to be fun and stupid because the general public thinks that superheroes are stupid and fun.
Sure. Right.
So we need to sell it that way.
So parodying is like the final stage of a genre.
It is. And that's exactly what they've come into. I mean, you look at the Marvel movies now, they're basically making fun of the fact, like, these things are just stupid stories about guys in costumes.
Yeah.
Because every time I tell them, it's like the original stories are based off are much, much more serious. No, like, really? And
but now they're restarting everything.
They're not right. That's a good point.
It's turned the superheroes what they've given the Marvel properties to a bunch of Hollywood executives that just want to make money, and they'll make money any way they can. They don't care about the property. They don't care about the
exactly,
and they've
never really read. They've never really read the material.
No.
They wait until after Favreau's Iron Man is a hit, and then all of a sudden they're all experts in comics.
Right,
it's ridiculous. So I'm going to move on to the next one so we can talk about it for a bit. A Superman for All Seasons. This is number 9 by Jeff Loeb. This one might have legitimately reached a level that we're talking about here. It basically is a retelling of Superman's beginnings, dealing with Clark Kent's transition from a teenager in Smallville to his early days as Superman in Metropolis. The symbolism of the seasons and the cycle of nature is hardly new in literature, but luckily in this instance, it's handled well by a capable author. The end result is a coming-of-age story that's rich in symbolism and themes and is also an entertaining read. It was also the main inspiration for the Smallville television show. Again, good idea. If we're talking about categorizing it as literature, again, if we want to entertain that conceit and say, okay, we're going to talk about whether it's literature. Well, so for this purposes of this discussion, we're entertaining a conceit of categories. So again, does it enter the level of the top literature? I don't know. It's a good
I'm not
story.
sure. I think Superman can as a character. I mean, I've seen him done before. I did like in the Zack Snyder movies, and he's playing other people's take on it. I do think it's interesting that Superman as a character. I mean, if he is equivalent to a god,
sure.
Like, how would the Earth react if somebody actually existed like that on planet Earth? That's what I liked about the Zack Snyder movies, and they've done this in comics where they explored Supermans. I mean, if somebody like this existed, it would completely change the way humans view themselves and view the world and view the concept of a god. So that, I think, you can get literary critiques about, the state of human existence and stuff like that. So I think you can do that with that character.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Rory, your thoughts?
Yeah, I'd throw in the criteria that, so it would have to, a comic as literature, have to add to the culture, and like Aaron said, it just can't just be mind-numbing. You have to be able to ponder on it, think about it. Does it teach you something?
Yes.
Yeah. Much like, Grimm's fairy tales were meant to teach kids things. Don't trust old ladies in the woods,
Yeah.
Can you ponder on it? Does it have layers that you can go through? And that you can read it as a child and as an adult and get something different out of it.
And does it illuminate a shared human experience, Roberta?
Right.
Yeah, and I was saying also, and it's got to be incredibly difficult for somebody to bring actual humanity to an alien called Superman. You know, trying to make him vulnerable and make him, you know, communicate that.
Yes.
That feeling, that humanity.
The human condition is all we know.
Yes.
Especially when there's so many things he won't really experience. I mean, if he is invulnerable, I mean, you would have to ask yourself, does Superman experience hunger?
Sure.
You know, things of that nature. I mean, he could survive in the vacuum of space. Does he experience hunger if he ever went hungry? Right. So there are things he's separating. I think Roberta's right. There are things that is that character you can study if you. I mean, he was based off the Ubermensch, which is like a circus strongman.
Sure.
But I do think I think he is the epitome superhero you can ask that. I mean, this is what they asked in Watchmen. And the Watchmen movie is a fantastic example of this.
Oh, we're going to get there. We're going to get there. Hold on.
Okay, all right.
Hold that thought. Rob, I want to get your take on the Superman for All season before we move on to the next one on the list.
Talking about me?
Yeah.
Yeah. I haven't read the book, so I don't know. But what I've read about it, it would probably come close to being literature. Again, I don't think in the times that it's written, you can really say that something's going to become literature or not.
Interesting.
I think whether it actually impacts the culture like Shakespeare has, like even Moby Dick, Eat Treasure Island, those sorts of things that were all written to entertain people, which is what comics are doing, is they're trying to entertain people. But they explored themes that rang true to people through the ages. While we're in the midst of living the age in which these were written, we really can't tell whether this is going to last or not and become literature.
Well, they were writing literature
I don't think that's possible.
You bring up an interesting point that one of the criterion should be time will tell. The endurance.
Right.
The endurance of the and I really don't think, back to Spider-Man Loves Mary Jane, I'm not really sure that's going to last the test of time.
Well, but would we have thought that the stuff, Pride and Prejudice and some of the stuff,
or Romeo and Juliet, but again, the glorious language of Shakespeare is also one of the reasons that it endures the test of time. There's no argument that he was a master of the English language. So again, that's part of it too. The artful nature of the language and the dialogue. Almost
he made up words.
Made up words.
Yeah,
but
he standardized words.
And the endurance of phrases from Hamlet, for instance, we quote Hamlet without even knowing it. It's such a famous play. But let me move on quickly.
How I wish we were better strangers.
Indeed, sir, indeed. Lucifer by Mike Carey. Now, this is a character that appears in Sandman. It's a spin-off from the Sandman character. Gaiman's interpretation of Satan, arguably the most interesting character in his book, and one of the most interesting depictions of the character since Paradise Lost. He closes this with, Lucifer is a true fantasy epic with larger-than-life characters involved in wars that will determine the fate of the universe. With it, isn't that like all superhero comics, though? I mean, seriously, what makes this one literature?
Quite often.
Interesting characters and epic storylines. Lucifer is a fun read. Okay, so he's saying it's a fun read. Well, there's a lot of fun reads with epic characters and fantasy story. So much so it seems like nothing more than a fun read until you reach the end. And then you realize just how deep the work actually is.
Well, he's
themed largely around the idea. Well, this part is where this is the meat of it. Themed largely around the idea of predestination versus free will. Okay, well, that's a deep subject. So if it really does explore that, again, this would qualify because, again, observation of the human condition and a universal approach. We all are trying to understand whether we truly have free will or is everything predestined? Is it a combination? The idea of our fate and how much control we have over it. Roberta, thoughts on that? I'm going to give the floor to you.
Well, sure. I mean, I think that, it's an intricate story. It is something that weaves in and out of Sandman, and not that you have to read Sandman to understand it. But I think in terms of like having those type of themes that you are really pondering, the nature of predestination, I think that's a very big topic that people don't really have a camp exactly attributed to it. It's like they think about it. They're not sure. I think a lot of people are really, truly not sure. So it makes it in that level of something that is more literary.
Yes.
To
I would
have
agree.
to explore that, to have to really feel that thought.
I would
That
agree.
and that doesn't mean that fluffier comics don't exist that touch on those things, but it really is the heart of it.
Yes, and I would agree with that. Let's see, Rory, thoughts?
You had a thought,
I
Rory?
never,
What?
never read it. Haven't seen the show. Can't comment on it too much. I mean, I can only assume things about making Lucifer the good
But
guy.
I mean, you believe in Satan,
anti-hero.
so
Yeah.
I mean, you have something to say about that.
It's a sympathetic view of Satan from the literary sense. Very much.
Yeah.
If you know Paradise Lost, you primarily know this particular subject matter. He just brings Paradise Lost into a contemporary environment, pretty much.
And I think it's worth exploring it. I think I think that the comic, the show, can do worthwhile exploring that. But in the end, I personally, with my beliefs, it will only ever come to one conclusion.
Right. Of course.
Which is fine, because if people are...
So it's predetermined.
Say, nice segue, Rob.
Only if you're
gets
right.
Segue the podcast. What? Only if you're
only if you're right.
Only if,
yeah.
Aaron, anything about this? Have you read Lucifer? I know you've read Sandman, at least some of it, but
I read the first part of it. Sandman's not for me. I tried. It's I don't know if it's a personal pet peeve of mine, but every time people take other types of literary characters, it's like, and everyone's like, now Winnie the Pooh is public domain, so everyone's writing Winnie the Pooh stories and stuff. I would just rather people think up their own stuff. Neil Gaiman's classic. He does do some of his own characters, but he's classic. Like when I was going there and it's like, Sandman's beating Cain or whatever. I'm like, do we have to do? It's like he has to meet all these famous literary characters or literary mythological characters because that's what makes it like tongue in cheek. I've read some stuff from Sandman that thought it was okay. I was never a big fan of Neil Gaiman. I don't know. There was something about him that I just, it's really hard for me to like sit there. How do I say this? People take credit. Like if you write something on Sandman or say something that's a popular genre and you make like say you write like a really popular story on The Wizard of Oz.
Okay.
You could do that, right?
Yeah.
How much of that is really your writing and skill doing that, or how much is that you taking advantage of the fan base that's already there because the original literary
I'm gonna have to say it's how it's done.
Yes,
the ideas that came in, it's how it's executed that makes it that approachable and that deep to the people that read it.
Yeah, I don't know.
I really loved it. I personally loved it. So
I know
we can battle it out.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people who can really love it. As far as like fate versus free will about Satan, my story Godlings is about that. I mean, that was one of the main things that I studied in college when I got, because my minor in college is philosophy. I almost got a degree in it.
I'm sorry.
So, I mean, it was the main, and of course they came to the conclusion like everything is fated because we don't know what's going to happen 5 minutes from now. And that was a philosophical take. I mean, but of course, if you go down that road, then why do anything?
Yeah.
And so even if choice is an illusion, it's the preferable illusion than the reality of fate.
Yeah.
But my book Godlings does discuss. I mean, that was the main theme and one of the main reasons why I wrote it. I've seen a lot of other stories tackle that same thing. Neon Genesis Evangelion tackles that.
Oh yeah.
Would you have would you have liked it a little bit better if he had if all the characters were his invention rather than borrowed literary icons? Would you have enjoyed it
sometimes
more?
I just think it's
even that's hard to do.
Yeah, it is.
Well, Shakespeare borrowed too.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. I'm not saying they borrowed. Because it's
world
like
building, really.
Yeah,
it is.
Well, it's world building, but I'm just like, we have these characters that are popular and people reuse them because there's already built-in fan base from the original literary work.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And so they're taking advantage of that and they're expanding upon it, whatever. But to me, I'm like, so does that just mean that the human race is going to be stuck with a handful of characters for the end of time because everyone keeps reusing them?
See,
I
that's
mean,
the
if you
point.
really want to
That's the
stretch
point
the
I want to
use
make.
of human
have a point.
imagination, then expand it.
Go-
I
Don't
go
agree
ahead,
with you
Rhoda.
if it's the same story.
What?
What I say, I agree with you totally if it's
Yeah.
the same story. I hate rehashing something or simplifying something just for the sake of it. But what I find in his references is kind of using it as its own language. If you know the story of X,
Yeah.
then that shades what he could say in a couple words about it. You know,
Yeah.
it's
But
like
it-
it's a language on its own if you're able to follow all that, if you're read enough to know.
It's a
You know, these
cultural
characters,
reference
so-
point.
Yeah.
It's a cultural
That's very true.
reference point.
It's
That's
a
very
cultural
true.
reference point,
That's a-
but
Yeah.
sometimes to me also when you start looking at the ideas of literary work, there's people who, how do I explain this? Like there's like when it comes to like solving problems or looking at things, there's 1,001 ways to look at it. Sometimes with these literary works, people look at the problems or the flaws inherent in the characters and they add on to it like different look. And I'm like, well, maybe if you step back and tackle the problem at a completely different angle. Instead of expanding on what's already written, expand it, write something completely original. Because even when I write about fate versus free will, the idea that I write in it is that both work together. They work in conjunction, which is what a teacher of mine talked about. That was kind of his idea. And I thought about that. I liked that. I wrote it. I've never read anything that's even talked about that. The idea that they were combined functions. And so I'm like, okay, so the fact that I stepped aside, actually thought about the base concept of what it was and wrote my own story. I wrote something completely original instead of taking what was already written and tweaking and expanding upon it, because you're still working from that same source thought, if that makes sense, and tweaking the thought instead of standing back and thinking of a completely different thought based on the original concept. I don't know if that makes any sense, but sometimes that's my...
Yeah, you
It's
can
like-
unpack that more, but
Yeah.
I'd say that
We get where you're
in
coming
short.
from. Keep
Hmm.
things original. You know, keep
Yeah.
things original in your
Well,
in
just-
your
which
opinion.
is hard to do.
Well, it expands the idea of human thought and human perception based, like, what are you perceiving in reality, instead of like, what this guy wrote on it. Like,
Right,
you see what
right,
this guy wrote? I'll write a little footnote on what he wrote, and then I expand it. I'm like, why don't you
Yeah,
just read
yeah,
that,
that's-
throw it away, go back and think about it for yourself, and write
Exactly.
what you think instead of scribbling notes on somebody else's thought from like 50 years ago.
Yep. Point
So I would
taken.
say-
Rob, what about
Mhm.
you? Thoughts? Any
well,
commentary on Sandman or any of these?
Well, like I said, they taking cultural reference points,
Mhm.
and in some cases, taking a slightly different view of it, and using that in order to delve into different thoughts that you're having, and philosophies about life, like Aaron did with his godlings.
Right,
Mhm.
right.
I mean, you used some. Didn't you use some Japanese references or some Asian references for some of that as well? Didn't
I
you
think
delve
so.
into
Well,
some of that?
I've been a practicing
So-
Taoist for over 20 years.
So-
So there's
So you
always
had
been-
some of those elements in there. So that's your cultural reference point for what
Right.
you wrote.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we all have those in our lives. We use those. We use those to help us explain what we're experiencing in this world, to help us to try and make sense out of what's going on around us.
Mhm.
That's what the gods
Right.
were about for
Right.
the Greeks,
Mhm.
is to help them
And-
understand what's happening in the
more
world. Why does the sun come up and move across the sky? Well, it's a guy in a chariot, flaming chariot pulled by horses. These are the kind of things to help us try and explain that. The story of Icarus, that's a man trying to exceed his grasp,
Mhm.
go above and beyond. It's trying to invest so you can use those touch points as a shorthand to get where you're trying to go with what you're trying to say.
Right. The only problem. Yeah.
It's the structure, it's the skeleton upon which you're building your story.
Mhm.
Right.
You,
The only
you've got
problem
to, yeah. Okay.
The only problem I have with that train of thought or that going down, because I understand most things work on the past, but if you, let's say somebody, you're writing off somebody's literary thought or idea, and you continue that train of thought. Well, the idea of most most philosophical thought was to try to get to the truth of reality, what's out there, the actual truth. What if that train of thought that you're piggybacking and going off of is the wrong train of thought, and you keep carrying it?
And there is that.
But the only way to break that train of thought is to go break it and think of something completely original, come at it. I mean, this is what scientists have to do all the time. I mean, they'll be going down a train of thought, and they have to sit. I mean,
and that could be
Einstein's theory of relativity. There's so many things that work with it, and there's a lot of stuff that goes smack against it, and we're like, crap, do we need to go back to an original train of thought?
And
going down the wrong path.
That's not moral.
And general relativity and put them together. So far, no.
Right, they don't work, but we can't figure that out.
Closer all the time. But the thing I'm saying is that in order to say you agree with with the skeleton, you agree with what the skeleton of your story. You think that has some truth to it. So that's why you're using that to build what you're building. Is that it supports the theory that you have about what things are. Yet you take it a little further. That's what makes it literature rather than just rehashing. You're taking it that next step in order to you're trying to delve deeper into it, and you have delved deeper into it. You go, well, here's what I want to say about that. Here's what I think that really means. So you take it to that next level.
I use completely original characters and completely original story.
Right.
And
So what
are you saying that
this is how you do it. It's how you do it that makes all the difference in the world. If you're completely piggybacking off of Icarus, say, as Rob's talking about, that's different from invoking a reference of Icarus.
Well, exactly. I mean, you have to start from something. I mean, the thought started from somewhere.
Can I go 10,000 feet up?
Yes, you can. Go.
So I would say that evil can only be a privation of the good or a perversion of the good.
Yeah.
It can only detract from it. He can only take away from it, drag it down. While good is something creative and new and manifesting.
Yeah, which is what J.R.R. Tolkien was saying with that the evil people in his stories couldn't create anything. All they could do was corrupt what was already there.
Corrupt it.
Right. Their power was the corruption, not creation. It was corruption.
Right.
And in fact, that was the intention of both Morgoth and Sauron was corruption of what was already here.
And
good point. Roberta, I didn't want to go
Roberta,
over.
You had
it. I just wanted to put a reference, like how far things go from just being an idea to being expanded into, an actual thoughtful world that gives even more ponder and more problems. I was going to lay the example of Handmaid's Tale.
Okay.
It's a wonderful story. It's very short, very impactful. There was a great movie, I think it was in the 90s or so, that I think when it turned out as a series, it was running off of the history of the fandom from it. But it did literally take a lot of thought to make the world realer or more darker,
more substantive,
more believable, more substantive.
Yeah.
So it took it beyond just a franchise, niche that I thought that's where they were going with it. But they turned it into really thoughtful, twisting the plot a lot further, more, putting more pieces at play, being more violent. It just was really still an interesting take.
I think along those lines, when we talk about world building as literature, J.K. Rowling did the same thing with just a boarding school for wizardry, right? And giving us how many 7 books in that world where the characters mature through their teenage years. And so again, she's borrowing so much from what's come before, everything from Arthurian to mythological lore of Western Europe and so on. But
she just picked names off a map in the UK.
Right, right.
It was very concealed.
It's very
concealed.
yes. And what she did was she took the template of something that is almost universally understood, which is the scholastic template, the calendar year, the academic year, growing up, bullies in school, best friends in school, romantic crushes in school, some succeed, some fail. All of these things, the mean teacher, the nice teacher. And again, she's hitting on all these universal concepts, and she's doing it in her own world. And so you get that well thought out, well crafted. And then she, along with that, she interweaves mythology from Western Europe with elves as she sees them, wizards as she sees them, and all this interesting stuff. But again, it felt original, even though, and this is to Aaron's point, even though most of it's borrowed, but it felt so original in its
execution.
Execution.
Yep.
Correct. Yeah. Fantastic example. I want to move on here because we're going to run out of time. And I'm going to jump to number 5 on Robert's list, Animal Man by Grant Morrison. Now, in order to approach something by Grant Morrison, if anybody knows how he writes, Grant Morrison is such a genius that if you don't understand what he writes, then you're a moron. And that's pretty much his position on everything. And the fandom is very divided in terms of, a Morrison person or Morrison non-fan, a fan or a non-fan. So here we go. I'm going to read this and just let you guys riff on this. This is an Animal Man description. Animal Man is an atypical superhero. He supports Greenpeace, PETA, and animal rights in general. He wants to be a superhero, and he wants to be able to make a living doing it, but he also dislikes violence. That isn't to say he's against killing someone in a fit of vengeful rage. Well, okay. Or accidentally joining a violent animal rights group. Okay, but he's against violence. Okay. He isn't even beyond something as simple as making a snap decision that he and his family are going to go vegetarian without thinking it through or even discussing it with his wife. Animal Man is a good and moral person with big ideals, but at the same time, he's far from perfect, like most people, prone to making mistakes and letting his emotions take control of him. Okay, well, so far it's like, okay, he's kind of a goofball character. It could be kind of a nice satire. So here we go with the Morrison part. Morrison is known for being one of the writers to first introduce higher literary devices.
Well, obviously.
Animal Man is the first serious work of postmodern metafiction in mainstream comics. The Psycho Pirate is regurgitating old comics from our world in an attempt to bring back the characters erased from continuity during the Crisis on Infinite Earths. Animal Man takes peyote and sees the reader reading the comic. Ultimately, Animal Man ends up on a quest to seek out what he rightfully believes is his own supreme being, Grant Morrison. Grant,
did he really say his own supreme being, Grant Morrison?
Grant Morrison, yes.
That's
Despite the fact that the book is very clear that it's just a comic book, the characters and their stories are still incredibly engaging and remain important to the reader. Plus, if you can read the entire series and get through the final book without crying, you have no soul.
Series?
I don't know, guys. I mean, when you're
satire,
writing,
right?
Yeah, it's series 1 through 26.
That's all satire, right?
Yeah. I'm not sure. I mean, honestly, ultimately, Animal Man ends up on a quest to seek out what he rightfully believes to be his supreme being, Grant Morrison, because Grant Morrison's the writer. Now, again, this is so meta that it's beyond our understanding, right? Because he's breaking the fourth wall, and the fifth wall, and the sixth wall, and every wall there is. And basically, I think, if you do as much drugs as it sounds,
does he write in second person too?
Right. I mean, it's kind of like, okay, well, if you're going to just write stream of consciousness, which, okay, there's parts of sound in the Fjord that are extremely hard to get through because of the way it's written, but that's art, right? It's somebody's art. It means something to them. They're sharing it. Okay, I'm open to that. I think it's Morrison's belief that he is a genius that really is off-putting to me, but I'm going to stop ranting here and let you guys take off from here. Anybody familiar, first of all, with Animal Man in a more intimate way? Have they read it?
I've never read it. I didn't read it. Thing I read.
Sounds like a wannabe Swamp Thing.
I read Planet. He wrote Planetary, right?
Yeah, I believe so.
Yeah.
I enjoyed Planetary and Authority. I'm trying to think of other things I've read that he's written. I don't know. This is the same way I think about the guy who wrote Watchmen, Alan Moore. He's a legend amongst himself.
In his own mind.
In his own mind, right?
Yeah, we're getting Alan Moore. It's gonna get fun.
Yeah, but Grant Morrison is up there. Again, I always think it's funny when I'll just say this one every time they talk about animal rights. Like, do I believe in animal rights? Sure. When the animal's eating your friend, well, that's the animal's right, dude.
Yeah.
Leave him alone.
That's the animal's right.
Yeah, the animal's right, man. So just leave him alone. But he's eating my friend. Too bad, dude. Sorry.
Don't get too close.
Don't get too close. Yeah. I never read Animal Man, just because.
Animal Man, is it literature? I mean, okay, if you consider what this author describes as postmodern metafiction, okay, again,
okay, who came
these
up with that?
elitists love to invent language, right?
Yeah.
And again, inventing language and labels is, once again, a way of making something exclusive. I'm a part of a club, and I may accept you in my club, or I may not.
That was somebody's master's thesis or PhD doctorate. Yeah, somebody looking for a degree.
Somebody looking for a postmodern metafiction. Oh,
right.
Just hush. Right. I mean, you can just see them, in their brandy and cigars. Yes, metafiction.
Yeah, correct.
Yes, indeed. I remember, traveling in those days.
Let's convene a meeting about this.
Right. But anyway, anyone else on Grant Morrison's complete narcissism?
Negative.
He may be a narcissist, but the idea that you have to think about what he does to his characters as a writer is kind of interesting.
Well, yeah. I mean, there may be some value in deconstruction, and that's what really postmodernism is. It's a deconstruction of what, at least what I grew up with in terms of storytelling for comic books. I want to.
It's basically saying, like, this character's popular. I'm going to tell you why it sucks. My deconstruction.
Right. Yeah, pretty much. Let's destroy everything we believe about this character. And that, again, as an art form, it's valid. That's your art. That's what you're doing. Great. I don't necessarily know if that's going to last the test of time. Time will tell. It seems more like a device to me, like a maneuver, kind of a mechanized calculation.
I would see deconstructiveness as a tool. Like, I will deconstruct this character and then take what's useful, use it for something else.
Okay. Yeah. Fair enough. Yeah. We go to number 4, Superman Red Sun by Mark Millar. Mark Millar is famous now for.
I've read the Red Sun. It's an interesting thought experiment. What if he was born in Russia? But I don't. Yeah,
what if he was born in Russia?
Literature. I mean, I think you can read a lot more things that are more, like explore the the Red Scare or like the Cold War than if Superman was born in Russia. But
it works better if you completely understand the whole Superman.
Now this one,
the fact that he's the American way or whatever like that,
right?
Which I think they've taken that out of the comic now.
Yeah,
they have.
Yes, they have.
Yes, they have. That sucks.
All right.
Here's what it said. Yeah, the comrades have taken it out. Meanwhile, this is the end of the coverage there. Meanwhile, Superman's character is largely unchanged, even though he lands and grows up in Russia. This is interesting, though. Holding steadfast to a national philosophy that he considers righteous and moral and endeavoring to better the world and save lives. However, he does so with a philosophy that the Western world has long since determined to be at best unrealistic and at worst oppressive and evil. So it's a commentary literally on nationalism, the philosophy of nationalism, if it came from Cold War Russia.
It's Bizarro. It's Bizarro Superman.
Yeah, it's Bizarro Superman. In a way, but again, it can be certainly a wonderful academic discussion. Does that elevate it to literature? I'm not sure. Again, time will tell. Interesting. Right. Definitely bring for interesting philosophical discussion. Has anybody read that entire?
I did. I read it years ago, and I don't really remember much. Unfortunately, like I've read so many comics that I can like look at titles and be like, I read that one. I read.
Does he fight Batman?
I think he does. Yeah,
Yeah,
because
right.
Batman
He
actually
does.
has one of the,
Cartoon,
you know,
yeah.
the Russian hats. He has a hat and it has like the
Yeah.
bat symbol on it.
Oh,
Yeah,
that's very
Yeah.
cool. Very, very cool. Let's move on to number 3, Identity Crisis by Brad Meltzer. This is interesting. There were 7 issues here. It's now collected in the Identity Crisis graphic novel. Someone knows the secret identities of all the superheroes. Now they're targeting and killing their loved ones. This is essentially the plot to Identity Crisis. Major DC heroes like Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman have small, almost cameo-like appearances in the story. The major characters are the lesser-known characters like Elongated Man, Green Arrow, and the Atom. The story is a classic whodunit using superheroes and the reader trying to figure out who would kill their families and why. It also takes from modern crime dramas showing the superhero equivalent of a CSI-style investigation. See, that's kind of cool because they're taking 2 genres and sort of blending them.
It's the deconstruction again, though.
The deconstruction again, exactly. Again, we're, and again, maybe we're stumbling upon the answer because really I posited the question, what makes it literature? Maybe part of that answer could be deconstruction of the classic idea of the superhero in the modern world, because so many of these stories now bring contemporary perspective to iconic ideas, right? So Superman, again, as being raised in Russia, what would that be like? Identity crisis in this sort of crime story of whodunit, murdering the, it's dark. I guess it could be considered postmodern as well. So
but all the superhuman.
Yes. Maybe part of this is deconstruction has to be a component of what elevates this to literature.
Yeah.
But it also can reduce it away from the gravity that it had.
Correct. I agree.
Yep.
I agree. If one looks too closely at one's icons, right, it can kind of change your perspective. Now, that's a different kind of story. An example would be, for instance, A Day in the Life of Indiana Jones, let's say, right? So what if you just did a story about his day teaching a class at the university, right? Now, that might be considered postmodernity. It might even get elevated one day to, literary. But what you're really doing is you're saying, let's take a component of this iconic character's life that no one's really explored and go through his day. Like he gets up.
That's what Steve Patriots is doing.
Right.
Yeah, it's historical, a faux historical.
It's the outtakes, right?
Yeah.
It's the outtake, right? So,
yep.
Steam Patriots earns the theme to Masterpiece Theater at the So,
well, I feel like Steam Patriots is like the stories that didn't quite make it in, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And we're totally okay with that. Like just interjecting into the in-betweens. We don't need all the big fancy, occurrences. Just following the story along its way.
And
we're there.
Isn't the balance of that what makes for the very best in fantasy storytelling? The balancing of those things. Let's look at Tolkien. The need for Merry and Pippin to have second breakfast in the middle of this huge epic of fighting Sauron and marching all the way to Mount Doom to destroy the ring. But I'm hungry.
It comes in pints.
Right.
Yeah, it comes in pints. Exactly right.
Right.
So a wonderful
Which is
balance.
Cultural.
Yes, indeed. Let's look at some comments here before I forget. Critical Blast says, I like the CSI analysis in... Let me share this with you guys. I like the CSI analysis in superhero comics. I remember when Barry Allen was a flash facts kind of guy who used that to solve crimes just really fast. That's a great observation, Critical.
Good.
They used to have backup stories in Action Comics called The Private Life of Clark Kent that focused on his civilian day, his apartment, neighbors, etc. Brilliant
That sounds
observation.
great. I didn't see that.
Really does. Pop says, good show, guys. Well, thanks, Pop and Lady. He's very kind. Not to,
and Lady.
Thank you, Pops. We do our best. Let's move on to the ones that we would have thought off the top of our heads, most of us. The Dark Knight Returns by Frank Miller. Again, late 80s, this falls into the deconstruction. People have gotten tired of the superhero vigilante. Superman is the last active hero working in secret for the U.S. government. The others have all retired of their own volition, or they've been forced into retirement by Superman. As the crime rate rises in Gotham City and Two-Face is released from prison, a 59-year-old Bruce Wayne decides to come out of retirement and once again become Batman, leading to a fight to the death between Superman and Batman. Upon its release, the comic was ill-received in the mainstream press because of its darker portrayals of the heroes, but has since come to be regarded as not only one of the most important and influential Batman books, but one of the most important and influential comic books ever written. Now, again, this one occurred to me immediately when I thought of the topic because of what he just said. Falls into the line of deconstruction. It also falls into the line of time will tell because the comic came out in 1987, so that's quite a bit of time has passed. Thoughts, input on Dark Knight Returns. Roberta, thoughts on Dark Knight Returns?
Well, he's not the only dark character, but I think that did resonate with people more so. I think they wanted to explore that, having to see, how troubled he could be, how much of a line he could walk of being good and helpful versus, just out for it and hurt. And I think it's worth exploring that, trouble that he was in on what is his morality and where does that come from? And what is your morality to look at him and follow him or worry about where he's going?
Yes,
I think it's valid.
I think that's a brilliant way of putting it, by the way. The appeal of Batman, for me, as my favorite comic book hero, has always been the
I thought
struggle.
I was your favorite comic book hero.
Yeah.
Pipe down.
Yeah, it's sad, but yeah, it's got to be.
Don't make me come over there,
You're
Rory. I know
you're my number two. You're my number two, Aaron. But what I've always
well, that has a couple of different reasons.
Doesn't it though? Doesn't. But we're not going to go there. It's a family show. Family show. What I always thought was that struggle of walking that line between vengeance and justice, and what does that mean to the human being himself? What does it do to him to do that day in and day out? And I liked the fact that people have a great time exploring the light and dark of Bruce Wayne, the so-called psychosis of what he does. I also think that an analogous character over at Marvel, Daredevil, faces similar challenge there.
Very close in terms of the morality.
Again,
it's Miller.
Again. Yeah, again, Miller. Exploring this idea of vengeance versus justice, and at what point when you're fighting monsters do you become the monster yourself, and how do you hold that line?
Yes.
I think Rory wants to say something. Please enlighten us.
Definitely. I was going to say, if you're going to make a literature to a comic book, I would say A Canticle for Leibowitz and 1 Second After. Oh, thank you. So both are post-apocalyptic, which I have a fallen affinity for, but A Canticle for Leibowitz has a good round circle of a plot to it.
Okay.
And 1 Second After is a good trilogy, quadrilogy. I don't know what they're at anymore. But I think people would appreciate that.
Okay. Canticle for Leibowitz. I read that in college and remember it was pretty intense. The Left Hand of Darkness is also sci-fi novel. Okay, Roberta, you shared your thoughts on this. Aaron, I know how you feel about Batman. You hate him. You're tired of him.
No, actually, that was one of my favorites. Strangely enough,
mute Aaron. Just pass over.
Just pass over. No, it's funny. The Dark Knight Returns is my favorite Batman story, but it was the only one I really could get. I mean, I liked the other. I think that's the only one I own. But I've read a lot of Batman stories and stuff. But as far as the comic, that was my favorite take on him. That's why I kind of really liked that. And I have, the movie, and I've read the book a few times. Again, it's always hard. I mean, is it literature? I just thought it was more of an exploration of, what if a character retired? I just like the idea of what if somebody came back from retirement and fought crime.
Right.
I do, like I said, I do find I find this weird with any heroes, but I do find it weird that, they'll use Batman, for instance, that Batman goes out and beats up criminals. So he has to commit a crime of assault in order to stop a crime going on. I always thought that was a little strange. You know, but again, they've explored that he's a vigilante, it's against the law,
Yeah.
whatever. But the fact that he's like,
Is
you
it
know,
an impact?
well, yeah, like the criminals are beating up some innocent guy, so Batman beats him up, and it's like, wait,
It's kind of like that.
fighting fire
Yeah.
with fire. It doesn't really work, does it? But
Oh, Brent,
It's the same thing when I
It's
have that
greater
talk.
good question.
yeah, it's a greater good, and he's got a cape, so that makes
He's got a
that
cape, right.
you know.
No, it's okay.
Well, I always posit this question to all you X-Men fanatics out there.
Yeah.
It's like, how can Magneto be a good guy ever when his solution is to become what he escaped from when he escaped the Nazi death camp, to become a Nazi and say that his race, the mutant race, is the superior race and we should be subjugated under him. Now, he used to be part of a group called the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. They actually labeled it back then. Then they changed it. No, it's not evil.
No.
No, it's all great.
Soften it out.
An anecdote
I thought that was interesting that hypocrisy is almost never pointed out openly, right?
There's some. I think Claremont did that a little bit because it was weird that a Jewish guy. It's like, you subjugated my people, so I'm going to subjugate yours.
Yeah.
It's like, wait a second.
That doesn't really, it doesn't correlate.
Yeah.
And you would think that him as a bad guy would see that, like, you'd be like, oh wait,
Yeah.
Wait a second, I'm doing this.
I get it.
So is it the action or is it who you are? It's like where does it come from for him?
Yeah.
Well, you think if he was so if you'd be using his powers to like fight, human trafficking and other forms of slavery still existed in the world. But
Exactly. Brent, we want to welcome you to our discussion. We've been having a great time really exploring, wait for it.
Really exploring.
We've been exploring the literary nature of comics, what elevates them to literature, and whether they should be elevated at all, and which titles have that lofty perch and which maybe should and haven't been elevated to that point. And does it even matter? And should people label things just so they can be part of an elite club and tell other people they can't be part of that club? We have reached a couple of conclusions.
Well, now I can do that with Silverline.
One of
I
which
stream with Silverline.
Yes. One of which is time will tell. The test of time helps to illuminate whether something is literary or not. The other is, it seems from our examples that we've gotten to so far, and we're up to the number 2, I think, which was Dark Knight Returns, was that deconstruction has a big part of it. So taking these iconic heroes that we all grew up with from being kids and looking at them in a childish point of view, and then growing up our perspective, so to speak, and looking at them through the reflective goggles of
you give me a lot of credit, dude.
Well, not you. The rest of us. I'm just kidding.
Just take a seat back.
But what are your thoughts? Because we're going to move on to Watchmen, and I want to have plenty of time to get into Watchmen because I know Aaron's chomping at the bit. We're going to have to give him some Ritalin. But before we get there, we want to get your take on Dark Knight Returns. What did that do for you when it came out? Were you part of the hoopla, or were you, it's just another kind of, what if story, whatever,
it blew my mind.
Okay.
I mean, it did what I imagine did for a whole generation of comic readers, which was it made me think, oh, comics can do that? Dude.
Yeah.
So
I read
it for the first time in college, and I was a Marvel guy. Excuse me. And so I missed it the first time around. And so when I read it, I was like, wow, this is great. I feel like an adult while I'm reading this. I mean, I've read comics since I was all my life, basically. And I've known, even as I'm reading some really quality science fiction stories, some, classic studies in good and evil, that it is aiming for a demographic. And that demographic was largely younger than I was at the time. But suddenly I was reading a comic that was aimed at an intelligent reader who had probably gotten past middle school even. I remember thinking, wow, this is so different. So
yeah, I felt the same way reading it. It was like similar. The movie approach that was similar to that for me was the Dark Knight sort of entered that realm as well, because it was sort of like experiencing a real crime story that just happened to have Batman in it. And again, it owes its veritas, so to speak, to Dark Knight Returns, because Miller was the first one to really enter that realm and go, what if we really had, Batman and these characters, and what would society, how would we realistically respond to that? And I've always loved Miller's characterization of media response to both Batman, and because the media would absolutely hate the idea of Batman and loathe him, and again, looking at him as a contemporary realistic thing, how could you condone it? And then again, your teenage self is like, yeah, get the bad guy, right? So you're still walking that sort of line of, but again, you got to remember, as we always go back to, this is fantasy storytelling, and it's fun to explore the reality levels on that spectrum of how real is real and how real can we go. But ultimately, we're telling fantasy stories. Roberta, I can tell you're itching to jump in on this one.
Oh, it's okay. No. I'm good.
No. Rob, points on Batman and how you felt about Dark Knight Returns.
I kind of felt the same way Brent does.
Okay.
In that we were, even though there were still some childish elements to it, and there were,
sure.
The story spoke to an older Batman, number one, middle to late middle aged, and he talks about how he hurts all over, and and all that, and it all made a lot. It all made a lot of sense. It added an element of realism. It was, we're still talking about a guy in a costume,
sure,
beating up bad guys.
Yeah,
that it brought another level of realism to it. It seems like that's been from the first days of comic books. It was really, really out there. It built on pulp stories, which were really 100% escapist literature.
Sure.
In fact, there's a character called the Spider that in every one of his stories, New York City is completely and utterly destroyed by the bad guys before the Spider catches him. The next story, everything's back to normal again. And they destroy.
That's because the Spider secretly owns a construction company.
Each and every story is like that. Whereas, when we get to the 50s and 60s, and Stanley and Jack Kirby start inserting soap opera type themes into it, in the fact that there's a cliffhanger in every issue, and the story builds on the previous story.
Very interesting.
Then we get further, another 20 years down the road, or 15 years down the road, and we get to Dark Knight, and now we're starting to bring in more adult storytelling elements, and the characters are growing up more.
Sure.
And at that point, I stopped reading regularly comic books. So I don't know what the development has been since then, but I'm betting that there's been some element that's in today's comic books that is building upon that and taking it to that next level. I think, some Sandman was also, there was all that stuff going on in the 80s, the mid to late 80s, that kind of turned the whole thing of comic books upside down, turned it on its head, and changed how the stories were told. You can see that happening as time goes on, that the medium of comic books is growing towards something, and we don't know where it's going. We were talking about predetermination earlier.
Yes,
maybe there's some predetermined end to where the storytelling goes.
Right.
We don't know, but we're all headed there. So but
we're all going to be experiencing.
That's what's going on. That's the observation I'm making.
I agree with that. That's excellent observation.
I don't agree with your observation, Rob.
The contrary.
What do you know, Rob?
You just draw stuff. Okay.
We are finally.
I'll agree with you and one up it. What about?
Please.
What about the what's next? What if it actually regresses back
Wrong.
to what if
Wrong.
regresses back to some of the things that it had done already to affect a new set of people in a different way.
Yeah,
I think
that's
of course.
that may
That's
be what's
possible.
happening. But
Sure.
and I wanted to also make a point. It just reoccurred to me.
Wrong. Sorry.
Is-
That's not
I wanted to make another. Here's the thing.
You keep talking, man.
In the 1960s,
Oh, Roberta, I love you.
Jack Kirby came along and turned things on their head by
Mhm.
by taking a little bit of what had gone before, but creating new characters and new storytelling
Okay.
Mhm.
that comics hadn't used before.
Yeah.
So
Right.
but since then, we've built on the same characters and built on some of the same. We're still using Fantastic Four. We're still using
Yeah.
Captain America. We're still using Fantastic Four. Where's the new stuff coming out now? A lot of it's happening.
where's Fantastic
in
Five?
independent comics and
Well-
stuff like this guy's doing. You know?
Yeah.
That's a good
Mhm.
point. And I think what you're touching on, Rob, is part of the next phase is the wide open sandbox, which is the
I'm-
wide open
Mhm.
opportunities,
I'm
right?
hoping-
We have
I'm
And
hoping for
there
that.
too.
through
And there.
reaching an audience
Aaron,
Mhm.
more.
outside
I'm-
of the
I'm
gatekeeper.
Aaron, make
I'm
more.
hoping she's right. I'm hoping
Lots
he's
of more
right.
Aaron. More Aaron.
You know, I'm hoping. Yeah,
I agree.
I'm hoping that's where we're headed.
I think it
that's where we're
is.
headed.
I think it is. I think we're
I think
so.
blasting out,
Opening
of
it
the
up.
sandbox.
I want to see a bunch of new stuff. I want to see
I do too.
new
Yeah.
creative stuff.
I think
You
there
know,
are
on the
now
level of
formally. I think there are now formally different types of people able to satisfy those types of different perspectives of reading.
Of
Kirby.
course.
That's what I'm hoping. That.
Better than ever. Now, before we run out of time, we've got to touch on Watchmen. I
Yeah.
think everyone here and the audience as well is
It's
familiar
all right.
with the theme
Yeah.
of Watchmen.
Yeah.
It
Isn't it
is
about like a security group?
the Watchmen
Yeah.
1 through 12 by
Mall
Alan
cops.
Moore. This certainly deserves our background theme. It is better regarded than any other comic book in history. It has won numerous awards. It was the only comic book included in Time's list of the 100 greatest novels of all time. And it is the most popular work written by a man who is considered by most to be the greatest living comic book author. I'm sure Alan feels the same way about
I'm
himself.
sure it is.
Moore started by taking the idea of what it would really be like if superheroes existed. And what he ended up with was sexual deviancy, homosexuality, vigilantism, political and national exploitation, men and women who feel they're above the law, and a public that ultimately scorns their existence. Well, what a
Man, I'm
pleasant
reading the wrong
landscape
thing.
you've
I just saw a dude
created,
in
Alan.
a
Yeah,
knockoff.
seriously.
Wow, what a nihilist.
Where did that come
anyway,
from? Was that a Wikipedia
he's a
thing?
British guy. He's anarchist.
Oh, Brits. Oh.
Anyway, so anyone want to take a stab at Watchmen? When you read it, what did you think? What were your feelings on it? Were you like, greatest comic I've ever read? Or were you like,
No.
I read it
Didn't
after
care.
the fact. I read it years after the fact because I just couldn't get over the designs of the characters. I
Right.
just thought they looked. It just wasn't my style. Like I said, I was never big into superheroes, so I finally read it, and I remember getting to the ending and not getting what happened. I literally could not
it's
figure
not
out
obvious, is it?
what
It's not
happened. I'm
obvious.
like, what is this? A big leg and his people did? I don't know. And I flipped through the book at least for 30 minutes trying to figure out what
you
was
want me to
going
tell?
on.
Did you finally figure out what happened? They teleported.
I think a little bit. Somebody finally explained it to me.
They
But-
teleported a giant squid in and scared everybody.
Yeah, there was
Yeah.
just there was a part of me that like I understood.
What?
He
I
was
understood
playing.
Watchmen,
Yeah,
but go ahead, Rob.
he was playing on that whole bit was playing on a very famous cover of the Justice League of America, the JLA.
Yeah,
Starion,
makes sense.
that star-shaped alien.
Yeah,
It was all
wink, wink, nod,
hung
nod.
firmly in cheek.
Yeah.
The whole
Wait,
thing.
no, not.
Well, the reason why I always thought this Watchmen work, and I'm like, okay, so
Yeah,
to me,
it-
the
for
kind of
what
the
he was
test
trying
of
to
that
do.
a little bit was when they brought it to a movie. Okay, why? Now, of course, Alan Moore will say that not, but unfortunately, you're just not going to get the non-comic book people to read Watchmen. So if you present it in a movie, and he did it verbatim, and he changed the ending a little bit, which I thought the ending to the movie was better than the book. Yeah, you can see
It's
yeah,
more
it made
understandable.
It
Certainly
made more sense.
Yes.
Because the thing I thought in the book is when, it's like, well, the aliens are attacking, so this is going to unite humanity. I'm like, for like a year or two, and then they'll figure out the aliens aren't coming back and they'll start fighting again. So in the movie, when they made it Dr. Manhattan's always watching you, okay, that seemed a little, okay, if he's always watching, then that seems a little more plausible. And it was one of those things, like, even when I watched, like, Alan Moore, why didn't you think of this? Like, that's obvious. Regardless of that, when so many people watch that movie, if it was so impactful and literary, then there should have been more discussion and talk about it. But everyone who came out of that movie just said, like, I saw the dude with the big blue dong. That's it. That's literally most of the comments I heard. So I'm like, so the general public is either completely dumb or they don't get it. And then I thought, well, then somebody said, like, well, yeah, but it's a literary critique on comic books. I'm like, well, then that's why it didn't work with the general public, because they don't care about comic books.
Right. Exactly.
So it didn't work.
That's it.
Brent, virtue of not being a good movie also. Because I've watched it a couple of times, and frankly, it is just not well
paced. It's not great.
It follows way too closely to the comic, which that is a mistake. That, in fact, I would call it a rookie mistake. I couldn't believe that Zack Snyder did that.
Well, he did it because if they didn't, everybody would come down.
But what's weird is he then proceeded to make a mediocre product. I mean, he had so many scenes in that movie that followed like panel to the panel. What was in the comic?
The storytelling in that book is mediocre, and it's that way for a reason. Yeah. Again, it's turning everything on its head. There's very little dynamic in that. The only thing that I saw that was dynamic was the fight blanking.
Night Owl.
The guy. Yeah.
The
Rorschach has where he sets the guy on fire. That's the most dynamic stuff in the whole book. The rest of it's very static. There's not a whole lot of action. There's a little bit here and there, but most of the time it's static shots. The camera doesn't even take an angle. It's very straightforward. And in a movie, stuff's got to move.
Yeah,
that's the whole thing with a movie. It ain't moving. It ain't a movie. You know.
I mean, that is the biggest kind of element you have to consider for both the movie and the comic, which was the comic was static because it was not a superhero book. It was a book about it was discoursing on society and all the stuff you listed, Dean. I'd also put in a healthy dose of nihilism.
Yeah. Sure.
But then you have some Hollywood execs saying, well, let's do everyone loves this Watchmen comic. Why don't we do that as a superhero movie? That's immediately when they started to derail, because think of the cool action scene where what's his name? Night Owl and what's her name? Jupiter.
The girl. They're breaking people out. They're breaking Rorschach out.
The yellow Hispanics. Yeah, they're in the alley, and they're attacked by some guys, and they just Zack Snyder's camera angles just jump right into action, getting right in there with the slow motion and the cool. But if you look back and see that scene in the comic, they're just talking, and some guys attack him, and they just start beating him up, but they're still talking, and then they just keep going. It's because this isn't about.
It's not a thing.
Yeah.
If they had if Alan Moore had really emphasized the action, he would have had to de-emphasize everything else he was trying to do.
Right. Yep. He was turning it all on its head. Yep.
What, Roberta, thoughts, input, commentary?
Well, I guess, I kind of agree with Brent on a lot of levels. It goes over people's heads, I think, in a way. It to try to make a movie out of it kind of takes all the themes and just upends those. That's how I see it.
Yeah.
Well, the comic was written for comic book fans. The movie was made. I don't know who it was made for.
I think it was made for what they thought the comic book people liked.
Yes, but it didn't do it. It didn't work. I still have. I have it on DVD. Later. It still has the wrapper on it. I haven't opened it. I have. I keep thinking, well, I'd like to watch this, and then I go, well, everything I've read and seen from it, I'm going, I've read the comics, so why would I want to watch the movie? Because it's the same thing. Nothing's, not that much is different. And I thought the book said what it needed to say. They really didn't need to make a movie out of it. So
I don't know.
What Alan Moore said from the beginning. Hey, I'm curious, did any of you watch the Watchmen television show on HBO?
No.
I saw parts of some of the episodes. I was staying in a hotel, and part of it came on, and I watched it. And I went, "Yeah, that's about as engaging as the comic book was. It's pretty dull."
Yeah.
It was just,
Bye, Rory.
Rory,
We love you all. Love you all.
Oh, are you out?
you got to leave?
Yeah, got to run.
Okay,
School.
well, have fun.
That's cool stuff.
School stuff. I hear you, man. Thanks for joining us, my friend. As always, your input is appreciated.
Yes.
I want to make mine Silverline every time.
Every time, yo, every time.
Every time.
We're gonna hang for about 5 more minutes, and then we'll be making our Silverline on our way out as well.
Right.
Yep.
Adios.
Adios. See ya. So I think to recap a little bit of what we've explored and possibly discovered about what elevates a comic book to literary status, the perspective of the passage of time, the subject matter that is universal in the scope of human experience.
Dean on a bearskin rug.
Exactly. Well, in front of a fireplace.
That's right.
But we'll talk about that later.
With the music in the background.
Well, in honor of music in the background, I think Brent has earned a special place tonight. I don't know if you guys can hear this.
Oh yeah.
This is for Brent.
And thank you. I like it.
We got to close out on this, but I think part of the literary concept is deconstruction. It's certainly in our era, because what it does is it does an autopsy, if you will, on.
I'm distracted by Metallica. I'm sorry.
I know, right? Just what is it? What exactly does it mean to review superheroes, and what do they mean to us, and what kind of concepts does this bring to mind? I think it's worth exploring further, but again, keeping in our theme of no calculation, do what's genuine, do what's real for you. I would certainly not advise anyone to try to create literature. I would advise them to share something that's genuine and close to them, and
personal always is stronger.
And let history decide whether it's literature or not. Don't worry about it. Do what's real for you. And what's real for me is always saying goodbye with the same phrase, even though it makes me a little sad. But with Metallica in the background, it's not quite as sad. Thanks for bringing that to mind, Brent. And thank everybody for all your penance. We like to end with Make Mine
Silverline.
Good night, everybody.
I'm Pat Broderick. Make mine Silverline.